This is about retranslation. And that's what retranslation is. It's a second translation, a second TT, third, fourth, fifth to N, into the same language. Okay, retranslation. Same text translated twice, three, four, 5 times. Okay. And we ask why should that happen and what happens when it does happen. And we know that we've got the retranslation hypothesis, which says you come closer to the ST, to the start text with time, and we know that doesn't really work very well. But my question is a bit different here. I want to look at it in terms of completion. The great theorists of retranslation seem to say that one translation can come and be much better than the others, and I'm interested in that and why it should be better. And these are the great theorists that I'm interested in here. Goethe, on the one hand, I think is the first to really propose a three-step model, and Antoine Berman, who had his word to say much later on. And I think both are a bit engaged in a cyclical view of translation. What do I mean by a cyclical view? Well, it's basically this simple model of something going, a transfer model of translation. It goes from one side to the other, and in theory, it could go back again through back translation. And that's sort of early days models of equivalence. It's still with us. And we can take that view back to Saussure, who in the Cours de Linguistique Générale included this particular image of perfect communication from the brain through the mouth to the ear to the other and back. And we don't know if those people are male or female, anything in between, young, old, racial characteristics. They're just A and B, angels to get perfect communication. But most communication is not perfect, as we know. Now, I'm going to try to model that in terms of thermodynamics. I'm not an expert in it. You're not either, I hope, because if you are, you'll correct me all the way. But let's just take it to the basics. First law of thermodynamics, there's equilibrium in energy. Okay, the transfer of energy can go from one place to another and back again. Nothing's lost. What happened in the 19th century, this is the second law of thermodynamics, attributed to Carnot. All the images show him as being incredibly young to discover this principle. Second law says the first law is not correct. There's loss in transfer, hence irreversibility. That is, you cannot go from B back to A without losing something. Hence, there's an arrow of time in nature, and there is this uncontrolled loss. And that's a model of indeterminism and entropy within a more complex universe. Okay, you can read a lot into that. So that second law actually came on the back of empirical work on studying the transfer of heat and just measuring it and noticing that there is loss, and you conceive going one to the other, you come back and you've lost something, and you calculate that in terms of entropy. What does that have to do with translation, you ask? Well, we'll get there in a minute. Ilya Prigogine, he's Belgium, I try French, Belgian pronunciation, Prigogine, won a Nobel Prize actually for working on this. For seeing complexity in nature as being derived from this irreversibility of time. Okay, this arrow of time. In Aristotle, you've got a cyclical universe. The oak gets an acorn, the acorn goes an oak, etc. And Perugin says, no, nature is not like that. There is this entropy in it, which comes from the arrow of time. Right. Now, what does that have to do with translation? Well, obviously, I think that when you go translating from A into B, early on I modeled a transaction cost. You've got to pay the translator. You've got to label for the position of the translator, without even entering into all the cultural differences on the sides of one or the other. So I'm very much, or have been very much interested in that sort of thinking about translation. And I modeled natural equivalence as the ideology of a cyclical perfection. Things are the same on both sides. You can go from A to B and B back to A. And then directional equivalence, where there is necessarily loss and the arrow of time enters into things, and you've got a far more complex universe. These days, out of interest, I would add that natural equivalence, the ideology of natural equivalence, is reinforced in several ways, the main one being the use of power, authority. In a particular field, if equivalents are established by the authorities in that field, then they are established. You have to recognize that. It's not natural. It's an imposition on the indeterminate play of language, but yes, that happens. Now, to Goethe. Goethe says that a culture translating a foreign text needs 3 translations, or at least 3 translations, or translations of 3 different kinds, okay? The first one is this one, okay? Acquaints us with foreign countries on our own terms. I'm reading Andre Lefevere's translation here, so don't blame me, blame him. A simple prosaic translation is the best, okay? You're not interested in all these stylistics, etc. You just want to know what's there, okay? And it's a great service, says Goethe. He's not downplaying it at all, okay? The first step then says that this first translation surprises us with foreign excellence. And that's a very interesting observation. I rather suspect that it owes something to Descartes. I just want to pick up the homeliness, Häuslichkeit in German. Homeliness is a pretty good translation of it. It sounds pretty pejorative. I don't know if it was for Goethe, Häuslichkeit, belonging to a culture that was stateless at the time, or a language culture that was stateless. The Häuslichkeit might be something quite valuable for him, more than the homeliness would sound in English. I think, just given the dates, I think he might be including a wink to Descartes and the role of l'admiration. This first of the passions, when you say, what was that? What is that? And then you go in and you figure out if you like it or you don't like it, and you have a more complex emotional relationship with the foreign. But that first moment of impact, the surprise, l'admiration, I think that's in Goethe, and I find that traced back to Descartes. But I've dealt with that one elsewhere. Let's move on to the second step. I said there were 3 for Goethe. The second step is a second epoch, all right? So we're in a time frame in which the translator only tries to appropriate foreign content and reproduce it in his own, it's Lefevere's sexist translation, in their own sense, okay? The French use this method, okay? And for every foreign fruit, they demand a counterfeit, surrogate, is what the German actually says, okay? Planted in their own soil, classical model of les belles infidèles, all right? Having a dig at the French as Germans were wont to do at the time, okay? We experienced, erlebten wir den dritten Zeitraum, points out that the German process, according to Goethe, was different from the French and has been completed, which is strange if you think about it. Okay, we get to the highest and the final one, der höchste und letzte. What is this great highest and last? Retranslation. The one in which the aim is to make the original identical with the translation. What? So that one would not be valued instead of the other, but in the other's stead. That's Lefevere having a go at what Goethe says there. Anstatt den instead of the other, that's true, sondern an der Stelle. I would say not just in place of the other, but in the place of the other. That is, you've got no need now to go back to the text in the foreign language. You have appropriated it and your understanding of the foreign entirely. This is an interesting ideal. This is somehow the exact translation that comes into two cultures coming together. Okay. I've skipped something there, have I? Yes. To do this, you have to overcome great resistance. Okay. They have to abandon the originality of their own nation. There's a certain sense of treason there. And a third comes into existence. And the taste of the multitude must first be shaped towards it. So this is where you can see Schleiermacher getting the idea of taking the receiver to the text in this third stage, whereas the French model would have been of taking the text to the receiver in the second stage. Okay, so this is a forerunner, certainly, of Schleiermacher's theory of the two directions. And then we do find in the German text here the verb bilden. Okay, shaped towards it. Bilden is to educate, to form, to educate. And Antoine Berman makes a lot of that verb bilden, Bildung, and the role of translation in actually shaping the receiving public, educating them, if you like. And the example there is Voss's translation of Homer into German hexameters. By all accounts, lots of resistance at the beginning, but gradually gained the depths and became a standard translation that was referred to. Now, what interests me in Goethe is why this third step is presumed to be final. And I'm just going into the text here to find out, okay? He does say, we get to this wonderful third stage, and so the circle is closed at last. You see that completion that I was talking about, the two models that I had of ideal natural equivalence and communication and saussure, okay? And then, indeed, the coming together of the foreign and the native, the unknown approximation and the known, keep moving towards each other. This is strange. It's like within the circle, something else is happening, like subatomic particles moving within there, okay? Moving towards each other doesn't mean that they fuse, perhaps not. Perhaps in some kind of differential calculus, they remain close but never exactly the same, all right? Still, there's certainly that idealism in Goethe, the enlightened romantic, never doubting that we will understand the foreign culture. Okay. Well, allowing a very close approximation, let's put it that way. Okay. Now, the interest of the text in Goethe is that he says that, and those three moments are very clear, and that's what's cited all over the place. But if you read the text and you read the next paragraph, these three epochs are repeated and inverted in every literature. These three methods can be applied simultaneously. What? You've just got 1, 2, 3, beautiful model, and then you say, wait a minute, it can go the other way, and they can all come together, and there might be things in between these three. So sort of, yeah, there's an ideal model, but you know what? It doesn't really work. Okay. Why might it not work? And Goethe's text picks up several particular reasons. The first is that he's aware there are different readerships in the receiving culture. It's not like everybody is at the same point, especially if some of them are going to be educated by translations and others aren't. So you've got a heterogeneous reading public requiring different kinds of translations. There'll be at different stages of this ideal process, if you like. And therefore, the experience of time is not uniform within the receiving culture. The way that the translation manipulates or construes the experience of time, the distance of the foreign text in time and in place, but here we're interested in time because of the arrow of time thing, suggests that at any historical moment, the experience of that historical moment with relation to the other culture and the past is different for different parts of the receiving culture. That this multiplication of the experience of time through translations is itself a fact of retranslation and does explain why that tripartite, the three-step model, is not really giving you the whole deal. Okay, which might also explain why the retranslation hypothesis is found to fail in most empirical studies. Surprise, surprise, it was there in Goethe, if you know where to look. Let me move on to Antoine Berman. Okay, he wrote a short paper on retranslation, but it's cited a lot, and in the paper he does refer back to Goethe, so he knows what's come before him. Berman has something new to say about it, though, and he says, firstly, because retranslation is necessary because translations age, and because no translation is the translation. He starts at the beginning, okay? Because translation is an activity that is subservient to time, and an activity that has its own temporality, that of expiration, caducité, something goes like, food reaches its use-by date, and incompletion. Now this is intriguing in view of what I just said about translations forming the experience of time. Here the translations are subservient to time. There's a translation into French. French culture evolves, but therefore we need new translations. It's the culture or the society that has the arrow of time, and the translations are catching up. Therefore you get this incompletion, inachèvement, okay? Which is another way of explaining why the circle is never completely closed. All right, it's okay. I don't like it as much as Goethe, because Goethe allows that the translations are active, but Berman has a trick up his sleeve, okay? History shows that there exist translations that last just like originals, okay? That, I think Walter Benjamin said that the translation is always fleeting. The translations will never last like the original, but Berman says, no, there are some that do this, just like the originals, and that sometimes shine more brightly than the originals. Yeah, there are cases, indeed. These are the translations that are to be called, qu'il est convenu d'appeler, are to be called, that people agree to call, I don't know who agrees, we agree, somebody agrees, great translations. Well, tell me more about these great translations, Antoine. The great translation needs kairos, the favorable moment. Everything comes together and this great work of art is produced. The moment of kairos stands outside the arrow of time. It is like that circle within which Goethe had the cultures moving closer and closer to each other in an enlightened cosmopolitanism. Here it's perhaps just luck that things come together. Making the translation first and foremost an event in the target language, both written and spoken. This is good. It points out that the act of translation in forming, educating, etc., is not just enough to have a text. You have to have an event, and there has to be lots of promotion around it and get people to bring to it and debate, and that this can produce the great translation, which will stand outside of time and no longer be subservient, therefore, to the natural historical aging or evolution, if you like, of the target culture. Now, when I compare these two, that's just a quick summary of Antoine Berman. Let's compare Goethe and Berman. It's obvious I prefer one than the other, but let's see why. Okay. Now Berman sees the intra or juxtalinear version as the first, okay? Whereas in Goethe, it's the third. Berman does not say the great translation is closer to the original. He says it's an event in its own right. And we'll see an example of that in just a minute. So they've got the same idea, but if you look at their examples, they're quite different. For Berman, the great translation is an event in the target language. For Goethe, the event is this surprise in the first stage. Okay, so it's a kind of inversion of stages 1 and 3 in Goethe's terms, but in Berman's world, there's just one and great. Okay, there's just two. There's just the flock of everything that follows society, and then the great translation that stands out. So they're actually the reverse if you look at some of the examples. Okay, for Berman, there's a series of small cycles that stop because of greatness. In Goethe, it's stopped because the reading public has been changed. But the event thing could handle that in Berman. Berman doesn't appear to go into reception. Goethe does talk about reading publics and their relation to the translation. There's something there in Berman that is agreed value. Il est convenu d'appeler. Everybody in French culture agree, oh, that's a great translation. All right, which somehow doesn't need to be justified in terms of actual reception or studying who is calling this a great translation. Now, a foremost example, one of the examples that's named by Berman is Baudelaire's translation of Edgar Allan Poe. Okay, and I'll just pause on this example. Because it's about the only one I know a little bit about, okay? Now, Baudelaire, we know, came across Poe and decided that Poe would be his brother on the other side of the Atlantic. You know, when I first read Poe, I found ideas, thoughts that he had expressed even before I had thought them myself. You know, this is absolute doppelganger idea on the other side. So we get this from the beginning when he's claiming to Sainte-Beuve, I think, writing there. Il faut, c'est-à-dire, je désire. Edgar Poe, I desire that even though he's no great shakes in the United States, he must become a great man for France. Okay, so yeah, it's this irony. He knows that he's a poor old drug poet on the other side there, but he will create him as a great poet and writer, more writer because he was translating into prose in France. All right, and so Berman cites this as the great text, the Baudelaire's translations of Poe, which stand above the ruck, and it's true. These became the STs. These became the translations that were then translated into many European languages, including Spanish, from Baudelaire's French rather than going back to the English. And Baudelaire's publicity promoted the European Poe, not just the French Poe. But much as Antoine Berman will say, the great translation stops all others. It is very, very easy to look at the translations of Poe. Here we've got 1844 to 1899. Okay, that's just 19th century translations. You've got 204 of them into French. Admittedly, 41 by Baudelaire, we're counting editions here. But, hey, come on, it didn't stop. Among the translators, yes, we have Mallarmé, for example. Okay. It didn't stop at all. History didn't stand back and say, oh, wow, time stands still because of Kairos. No, history marched forward, and the great translation didn't perform as Antoine Berman would have us suppose. If I look at the French Bibliothèque Nationale, Bibliothèque de France, I think it's called now, we can find 215 books by Poe in French, and some of them are by Baudelaire, but by no means all of them. Why am I interested in this? Why am I interested in that? The fact, first, that Goethe recognizes that the completion of his three-step model doesn't actually occur, and that the greatness that Berman attributes to the great translation, others would be the King James Bible, yeah, sure, a great translation that stands somehow above the rut, but it's by no means stopped the other retranslations happening. Why am I interested in the fact that there is no closed circle? Well, because the continuation of retranslation shows the entropy. Okay, shows that that second law of thermodynamics is operating over and above any idealization of the first law of constant energy, of natural equivalence, etc. It has a political dimension, though, and that's what I'm going to close on here. Now, one of my favorite quotes about translating for immigrant communities, actually in England, in this case, England, not the United Kingdom. In England is Mr. Pickles, and who said at one stage, you should not use translations for immigrants, okay? Because make them learn English, and that if you give them translations, that will stop them from learning English, all right? The idea here is that the immigrant comes in, might be given one translation, but don't do that. They'll move and be completely integrated into your Häuslichkeit, the homeliness of your home culture, the integration of the other. The end of the retranslation is the integration of the other into the culture. That's a model that certainly owes a lot to Romanticism and German Romanticism in particular, and to nationalisms of all ilk. But we are living in migrant societies where incoming immigrants form communities within our societies and welcome further intakes. Okay, one of the studies of these is by Jim Clavach, looks at Macedonian community in Australia, and it's very, very empirically documented the way the first immigrants form a beachhead, but then they welcome the next ones, which welcome the next ones, and each is helping the other in a progressive repeated cycles of retranslations, which are qualitatively different because of the generation gaps involved, okay? That there is not just one closed retranslation. We come to grasp the foreign culture, and the foreign culture is identical with us. In the place of, no, okay, the place itself becomes different. We found this when interviewing translators of COVID material. This is from Rachel Mitch-Predy's doctoral research. When we find people saying that they are operating within generation gaps and kids are interpreting for their parents, we know that as well. And that through the kids and at school you get parents getting different degrees of awareness of the other language through very different kinds of translation. And the kids are operating within that translation process as well, even in the third generation when we get them coming to university to learn a language so they can speak with their grandparents. Okay. That's a simple point. There is no closure. It doesn't finish. Retranslation doesn't finish. Forget this 1, 2, 3 model. Forget this great thing, everything stands still model. No, sir. Second law of thermodynamics. It's ongoing. Okay. Translation changes the homes. That's the message. And that slippage of retranslations means that there is no cyclical closure. Okay. That was it. That's what I have to say about retranslation. That's the definition. TTN, it says. TTN, to the nth, as many as it takes, because history hasn't stopped here. It'll keep going.